Yes.
Okay. Herzlich willkommen zu einem ganz besonderen Jacobin Livestream. Nicht nur einfach irgendeinem, sondern dem Booklaunch unseres ersten Buches im Brumaire Verlag, nämlich Stolen von Grace Blakeley. Und Grace ist auch hier mit mir. Welcome, Grace. Thank you for joining us now. You just published your book, or it came out today, but in the pandemic, it's just not as cool as seeing you, having you on a stage here, signing books and stuff.
I'll be back.
Yeah, we will do that later on. But yeah, we did finish this, and I'm so happy and proud to show it to you. It's like this beautiful neon salmon red, and it's like super shiny. But more than the color, I think it's important to talk about the content. And I'm going to do a little introduction now in German, so Grace can just
go ahead.
Focus and prepare. So, also wie ihr gerade schon mitbekommen habt, die Veranstaltung ist auf Englisch, weil Grace Englisch spricht, und deshalb werden wir auch über das Buch und wie wir die Welt vor dem Finanzkapitalismus retten auf Englisch besprechen. Ihr könnt gerne Fragen stellen und auch euch beteiligen im Chat, aber es geht eben dann auf Englisch. Wir werden das Ganze auf Englisch machen, und Graces Buch ist 2019 auch auf Englisch erschienen bei Repeater Books, und wir fanden es so gut, weil es so prägnant den ganzen Weg, die ganze Geschichte bis zur Finanzkrise 2008 beleuchtet und warum der Kapitalismus immer wieder in Krisen gerät. Also einmal das Strukturelle beleuchtet und zum Schluss auch noch, das finde ich ist das Besondere in Ihrem Buch, dass es nicht nur verständlich ist und über die kapitalistischen Krisen spricht, aus einer historischen Perspektive, sondern auch noch Vorschläge macht, wie wir uns von vor diesem Finanzkapitalismus retten können. Das heißt, wie wir tatsächlich Institutionen reformieren können, wie wir einen demokratischen Sozialismus, eine Art von Transformation in den schon bestehenden Institutionen überhaupt denken können. Was muss da getan werden? Wie kann man die Rechte und die Macht von den arbeitenden Menschen stärken? Und deswegen finde ich es so besonders inspirierend, und wir haben uns eben entschieden, dieses Buch von Grace dann auch zu übersetzen, und das ist sogar unser erstes Buch eben im Verlag ist, und wir sind sehr stolz darauf, und der Verlag, der Brumaire Verlag, bringt auch Jacobin heraus, also das ist unsere eigentliche Aufgabe, deswegen ist es auch ein Jacobin Livestream, und auch Jacobin könnt ihr wie das Buch bei uns im Shop bestellen, am besten unter brumaireverlag.de, und auch hier drunter sind die Links, wie ihr direkt da zu dem Verlag kommt, und bei jacobin.de, wie ihr sofort zu dem Magazin kommt. Das Buch hat 408 Seiten und kostet 18 €. Es ist versandkostenfrei, kann es zu euch geliefert werden, wenn ihr es jetzt bestellt, und wir würden uns natürlich sehr, sehr freuen. Jetzt reden wir aber über den Finanzkapitalismus und warum er immer wieder in Krisen gerät und auch warum es Finanzkapitalismus heißt und nicht einfach nur Kapitalismus. So, Grace, we're going to do this now. Switch to English now. I hope that all the German readers are now, I think they're very curious to hear what you have to say, because it's been a crazy week. I mean, it's been a crazy year last year. It's been really absurd. And I mean, what happened with GameStop like last week? Has this proven your point that like more morbid symptoms and more absurdities have reached the financial markets? And how can we make sense of that?
Yeah, so the GameStop thing is really interesting, because I think it's a perfect example of the financialization of the household, which is what I talk about in I think the third chapter of the book, the second or third chapter, where I look at basically the way in which a kind of particular type of subject has been constructed by the shift towards neoliberalism and financialization. And I look at those as really kind of, two sides of the same coin. Neoliberalism is a kind of ideological shift and a policy shift, and financialization is part of the material consequences of that shift. But also, I mean, understanding financialization as something slightly deeper than that exists kind of inherently within the development of the capitalist system as like a tendency for financial interests to dominate production in various different ways, and for various forms of rentierism to become more important in the accumulation strategies of capitalists. So yeah, this idea of the kind of financialization of the household is based on an observation that households have become much more kind of integrated with financial markets, particularly over the course of the last 40, 50 years, because obviously it was during the 1970s and 80s where we saw mass deregulation of financial markets. So things like, for example, the removal of restrictions on capital mobility, in many countries, the removal of credit controls as well, so both credit and exchange controls, which just dramatically expanded the ease with which capital was able to flow around both the world and individual economies, and also just the access to capital that many financial institutions had, both in terms of investment capital, but also in terms of their capacity to lend, which was something that was restricted by regulation before. Accompanying that, a lot of other changes to policy that serve to reinforce that kind of shift towards what I call finance-led growth. I look in the book at all the ways in which this shift affected different sectors of the economy. So I take the kind of Keynesian demand equation. Government spending is, total output is made of consumer spending, investment by businesses, government spending, and the exports, and then look at how financialization has affected households, businesses, the state, and the international economy. And the household thing is something that a lot of people find the most interesting, because, as I said, it's about the kind of way in which household finances have become much more integrated with financial markets. Now, kind of very simplistically, you can think about this as, 60 or 70 years ago, a household's perception of their own their financial situation was likely to be substantially linked to the income of the main earners in that household, as well as, some consideration of the assets that household had. But those assets were, for the most households, unlikely to be that substantial. Shift forward to today, and the household balance sheet has become much more complicated. So it's not just a question of incomes of main earners, it's incomes of main earners combined with private pension pots, combined with the value of your house, maybe the value of your other investments, and also that set against the debt that you maybe went into to acquire some of those assets. So your perception of your own financial well-being is intimately tied up to the performance of financial markets. And the way in which I look at this in terms of political economy is in analyzing the shift from the kind of post-war model to the neoliberal model. That shift was associated with a marked increase in inequality within societies in the global north, within kind of wealthier societies. And the kind of clever political fix, I suppose, that was developed to conceal that rise in inequality was to extend asset ownership to a wider swathe of the population, so to many more members of the working class. And in doing so, creating a class of kind of mini capitalists who had some pensions wealth, some housing wealth, and therefore, were basically had an incentive to support the maintenance of the status quo. This is obviously particularly the case in the period before the financial crisis, when house prices were going up and up and up, and same with share prices. The importance of that coalition of kind of professional managerial workers in the global north to underpinning that shift towards neoliberalism was really, really substantial, and it was all tied up with deregulation of financial markets and the financialization of the household. But it was also, and this is, I think, a really important point to always come back to, it wasn't the case that suddenly this process of financialization had started to undermine the system of commodity production upon which capitalism is based. It's not like we went from industrial capitalism, where you produce commodities, to financial capitalism, where it's just MM rather than MCM. It was a political process, similar to, I suppose, the process that you had in the post-war period, where a lot of production was outsourced to the global south. And partly this was about, obviously, again, disguising that conflict between capital and labor, because there would be relatively higher paid workers in the global north. And a lot of that was dependent upon the existence of very, very low paid workers producing commodities that were imported from the global south. And a similar sort of process takes place after the transition towards neoliberalism, because what facilitated the dramatic increase in asset ownership and the financialization of the household in the global north was financial globalization at the level of the international economy. So, I mean, effectively, because of, well, for a number of different reasons that I talk about in the book, but basically the US and the UK in particular had these very, very big current account deficits, which meant that they were basically kind of importing capital from the rest of the world. And that capital was going into lots of different areas, but particularly into the banking system, and often via the banking system into mortgage payments, either, you know, supporting banks to make those mortgages, or in the US case, directly many investors in the global south, and particularly the Chinese, who had a lot of dollars to use, were purchasing these mortgage-backed securities that facilitated the financial crisis and facilitated the big expansion in credit that was going to low-income households in the US. So that was very much, you know, that process of financialization was very much contingent upon a deepening of inequality at the level of the global economy. And yeah, this kind of new process, whereas, you know, previously many kind of modernization theorists and others thought that, you know, because of the different rates of growth in the rich world and the poor world, capital would flow from the rich world to the poor world and would support development. Whereas actually what we ended up seeing, for a lot of different reasons, I mean, a lot of this is as well linked up with things like corruption and tax avoidance and money laundering, where capital kind of flows out of the global south through illicit channels. But it's also to do with kind of different structural reasons that we can perhaps talk about later. The process of financialization in the global north was supported by this capital export from the global south. And the GameStop saga really kind of links into all of these different trends. So firstly, you have a massive boom in US stock markets. This is driven by, one, quantitative easing. So the Federal Reserve's purchase of many, you know, lots and lots of different assets, both, yes, US treasuries, but also increasingly like privately owned securities. So, you know, things like corporate debt of various different kinds, and increasingly municipal debt, yes, mortgage-backed securities as well, assets that are basically, kind of facilitating lending in lots of different areas of the economy. And in purchasing those assets, they've driven up, as we saw in the wake of the financial crisis as well, when a similar process happened, they have driven up equities prices in the US, and we've just seen a huge increase in things like, you know, the market capitalization to GDP ratio, which shows the kind of market capitalization in stock markets versus the output of a whole economy. Usually, you know, that level of increase would suggest a bubble that was ready to burst, but because this is all underpinned by the Federal Reserve, it creates a very different situation. And the reason that happened was very much linked with this process of financialization. So in the wake of the financial crisis, there was this decision that monetary policy would be used to promote the recovery rather than fiscal policy. So we had very, very loose monetary policy throughout the global north, and often that combined with tight fiscal policy. And what that did is basically the tight fiscal policy constrained wages, constrained investment, but the very loose monetary policy created lots and lots of liquidity, basically, that was seeking out high yields. And so what that did was it went into equities, into housing, into various other assets, pushed up the prices of those assets and increased wealth inequality. So actually, you know, deepened some of these issues that had taken place before the crisis. So that's very linked with financialization. The other thing is the fact that another element in the boom in US stock markets, and particularly in US stock markets, has been a massive outflow of capital from global south into global north again. So after the last financial crisis, interest rates came very, very low in the rich world. So a lot of capital flooded out into the global south, often in the form of various different forms of lending. So lending to states, but also lending to private corporations. And often that lending was done in dollars. So those firms and governments therefore needed access to dollars to pay their debts. During this crisis, that capital has sharply flowed back into the global north. And we've seen, one of the biggest outflows of capital from the global south that we've ever seen. And again, a lot of that money has been sucked back into the US and has gone into US assets and US equities, which has reinforced that process. And then, the thing that really catalyzed the whole GameStop saga was obviously ordinary households with stimulus checks who were looking at what's going on in the stock market, thinking the stock market's up here, my wages are here, and they're not changing. I can't unionize probably because either my company has a union busting policy, or I live in a right to work state where there's no protection for unionization. So I can't really change my income. I can't organize to try and, increase the returns to my labor. So what am I going to do? Okay, I'm going to buy into this idea that I am a mini capitalist and I can actually increase my standard of living through the stock market. So these people took all this money, invested it in this particular share, thinking that they would, it was actually a couple of different shares that had been shorted by hedge funds. And obviously they knew that in buying up those shares, they would squeeze the positions of those hedge funds and potentially ruin those hedge funds and also make themselves a lot of money in the process. And it's been interesting to see that happen and the way in which different areas of the state and of capital have responded to that. But I think the impulse, which is to say, and I wrote a piece about this, we have no power as workers, so let's try and exercise it as owners, is very, very intimately linked to this process of financialization that I mentioned and I talk about extensively in the book. And it's not only kind of, squeezing people's attention and kind of desire and capacity to organize away from unions and, protest and direct action and whatever into this playing around with the stock market. It's also very exclusionary for all the reasons I've just said, because actually we don't live in an economy in which everyone can buy shares. A lot of people have much, much, much more debt than they have assets. A lot of people will have used those stimulus checks just to pay off credit card debt or to pay their rent. Others will have been able to invest it in stock markets. And when you look at this at the level of the global economy, I mean, the profits that are being made and distributed to shareholders in the US are largely being generated by workers who are being hugely exploited in the global south. There's no route for kind of shareholder activism for them. So for the vast majority of people in the world, this is not something that's a possibility. Yet because we have this class of mini capitalists that has investments in stock markets that was created by this process of financialization, it seems as though maybe if we all invested cleverly enough, we could get a piece of the action. Of course, that's absolutely not true.
And it's exactly what Thatcher wanted us, right? Or what I guess, I mean, also neoliberal governments in different countries wanted, that everyone becomes a mini capitalist and you should all just buy assets. I mean, I'm reading like the sort of Financial Times for Germany every day, and then the FATS, and they love saying that we all should buy assets and we also become those kind of mini capitalists. But you would argue, I guess, that they're not actually capitalists. Like this hides the actual antagonism, not behind it, but I mean, kind of the antagonism is absent. And so it's a dead end to have this as a political strategy, to just be part of the market. And I think this is really a crucial point that you make in the book, but also now. I hear lots of people say in the debate, well, this is a revolution. It's good that they did it. And I mean, I find it funny. Like, I think like obviously it's funny to bet against a hedge fund. It has its, like, I mean, of course, people kind of have a community and start to organize in a way that is not organizing in a union, but there is something in it. And yet, I don't think we should foster this as a political strategy, right? I mean, all of your book says this hides the actual social antagonism between capital and labor.
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry, my mic was on mute. Yeah, no, exactly. And I kind of wrote that in the piece that I wrote for Tribune and that was republished by Jacobin in the US the other day. Yeah, I mean, where to start? You mentioned the German example there, which is, I think, interesting because, again, thinking about this idea that we can really democratize the ownership of capital, and therefore everyone will be able to put their little pot of savings into the stock market, and therefore everyone can become a capitalist. you know, in somewhere like Germany, that ideology is going to be very, very powerful because there's quite a substantial stock, and has been for a while, of savings in Germany. And this is a number of reasons, but it's the links between the kind of basically like devaluation of wages and the refusal by the German government to invest with the membership of the Eurozone, which obviously provides for a kind of, you know, relative to what a purely German currency would be, a less a devalued currency, which obviously makes Germany's exports more valuable internationally. And what that's done is it's given Germany this massive current account surplus. Most of that has gone into the pockets of German industrialists. A lot of it has also gone into the pockets of German savers. So there's this big contingent of German savers, and they were indeed a big part of the pushback against the ECB's new quantitative easing program, because the argument being, you know, any form of money creation is potentially going to damage the interests of German savers, and, you know, by creating inflation. Actually, this is completely and utterly untrue, because a lot of those savers will have their money invested in stock markets, and QE boosts equity prices. So in many ways, you know, it actually reinforces their interest. But then it is interesting that there is this extreme ideology around it, particularly in Germany, and that is creating these huge imbalances, which come at the expense of workers in the other part of the Eurozone. Because, of course, a lot of that money is basically being transferred from one part of the Eurozone to another. And it creates this pressure basically for countries that are experiencing a higher exchange rate relative to their kind of underlying competitiveness, that mean that they have to push down wages, that they can't invest, that they can't have high levels of government spending. At the same time, German savers and industrialists are doing quite well. And yet the German government, even though it has access to all this capital, is still saying, we're not going to invest. We want Schwarze Null. We are going for constant austerity that's going to last forever and ever and ever. And again, this is something that is reinforced by those imbalances of power. So this idea that we can kind of democratize access to capital is premised upon a set of assumptions that don't apply in the real world. Like, some people have wealth and positive savings. Other people have very substantially negative savings or basically no wealth, right? And those people, who are the majority of the world's population, will never really be able to kind of acquire ownership of capital. And even if they do, and this is the point that you were making about the kind of capitalist versus mini capitalist distinction, there is a really big difference between owning a share in a company and having a voice in the decisions that are being made by that company, and, like, you know, the capacity to influence its direction. I mean, we've seen this with pensions wealth, for example. So again, in that GameStop article I talked about, there was a reference to a book that was written 40, 50 years ago, which said, look, all of these workers own pensions, so they all own capital. So they're all, you know, basically the argument was, the US is therefore a socialist country because there are so many people with pensions who own all this capital, so access to capital is democratized. Now, of course, not only is that not quite true, because pensions wealth is very unequally distributed, those pensioners also not those pension holders don't have a voice really in the way that these companies are run, because they're investing via pension funds or via various forms of kind of mutual fund, or, you know, different institutions. They're not investing directly. They don't really have they don't have a collective voice that could be used to push these companies one way or another. And part of the reason that they don't have a collective voice is because there's such big class divides between these different groups of people. Like, pensions wealth is held disproportionately by the wealthy. They're not going to be the ones that are agitating for wage rises or, you know, for a company to pay its taxes. So yeah, this whole idea that by buying lots of shares, you can become a capitalist, i.e. someone that not only owns the means of production, but also controls how they're used, is built on this really big lie as well.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I had to mute myself because the heating is so loud in here. But it's not noisy now. And yeah, for everyone who just got in, we're talking about Grace's book Stolen, that just came out in German. You can order it at Brümer Verlag, and just follow the link. And I got like really interesting questions if you feel ready to answer some of them, because I think they will fit right now. Because Someone asked, how is the financial economy still connected to the industrial sector? Is there still this kind of connection? Because I think what many people think when you say financial-led growth, or I don't know, finance capitalism, financialization, you feel like this is something that is completely lost contact to the real world.
Yeah.
And the GameStop thing feels that way. It feels like something is happening somewhere, but it's actual losses and actual effects on the real economy. So how is this kind of
Yeah, I mean, this is really important. And I've had a lot of questions about this since the book came out. I mean, partly it's because these questions are from people who are looking at it maybe from a Marxist perspective, whereas the book was very much written for a lay audience. So I didn't go into all the details of the debate within Marxist theory about what financial capitalism is. And of course, the difficulty is that there is a conceptualization of financialization within Marxist thought, but there's also a very deep strain of talking and thinking about finance within kind of Keynesian thought. So a lot of people were saying, oh, is this Marxist or is it Keynesian? Is it this or is it that? Now, firstly, in terms of the audience that I was trying to influence and the debate I was trying to influence, it didn't really matter because most people have literally no idea what those differences come down to. But actually, whilst I did draw on some of Keynes's thought, and I think Keynes's thought is particularly interesting for understanding the capacity of capitalist financial markets to accurately convey price signals about different kinds of assets. So his thinking about, his two-price theory, which was developed by Minsky into his financial instability hypothesis, was very interesting and important for understanding the particular microdynamics that underpinned the financial crisis. But the whole approach of the book is based on the Marxist approach to financialization, which is basically, Marx kind of hints at this a little bit, particularly at the end of volume 1, but it's really drawn out in Hilferding with his long book, Finance Capital. Hilferding was not actually a great guy and called a lot of things wrong, both intellectually and politically. But this book is very interesting. It's a very interesting elaboration of Marx's thought on financialization. And effectively what the argument is that as capitalism develops, and this is really linked to Marx's argument about the centralization of capitalism, which is actually the work that I'm doing at the moment for my next book, which is that as capitalism develops, you get closer links between industrialists and financial institutions, basically because the costs of starting any one enterprise become bigger. And that's both because barriers to entry emerge as large companies become established. So it becomes more difficult to enter that market. But it's also because of the rising organic composition of capital, which means that in order to undertake a level of investment that allows you to produce commodities, you have to invest much, much, much more in buying means of production upon which labor can work. So basically, obviously the shift from just having more workers relative to capital to more capital relative to workers means that the costs of investment at the beginning of starting an enterprise rise. And what that means is that industrialists become more reliant upon financiers. So even if you have this huge pot of money as a kind of wealthy individual, or someone who's made clever investments or whatever, it's probably not going to be enough to start the next Amazon, right? Or to start the next, I don't know, Siemens or whatever. You need backing from another set of institutions. And Hilferding looks at how financial institutions emerge, firstly, to kind of basically agglomerate savings and profits from across the economy, and also often to serve the interests of sovereigns, basically, but also to provide lending to capitalists and to provide various forms of kind of financial instruments that facilitate trade, that facilitate various forms of investment. And eventually they grow to becoming these really important. Hilferding particularly focuses on banks, so it's more applicable to markets in which banks are dominant over capital markets when it comes to things like lending. But it is generally also true of financial institutions that operate mainly in capital markets, that industrialists become more reliant upon these institutions, and therefore those institutions can play a greater role in determining how those firms are run. Obviously, to a greater or lesser extent, an institution that has borrowed a large sum of money from a bank, from a set of investors, is somewhat accountable to those investors. Also, another thing that works towards that is the development of the stock market. Marx again talks about how how the emergence of joint stock companies and big banking institutions facilitates this process of centralization of capital, which basically kind of the move towards much greater levels of market concentration, so more kind of monopoly and oligopoly power. And the joint stock company plays a really important role in this because it means that shareholders are also, so the shareholders in a company can also be the kinds of financial institutions that are also lending as well. So they can exercise this control via lending, but also because, a lot of the time they're owners. And this is more the case with kind of big asset managers today than it is with banks. But obviously banks have their own trading and that sort of stuff as well. So yeah, that is the kind of process that underpins financialization, and it's highly linked in the Marxist account to imperialism. And this is because the big monopolies that emerge in the global north through this process of centralization and financialization come to basically they need to export their capital. They need to invest in other parts of the world where returns are higher. Often they're higher because, there hasn't been this history of workers gaining rights and increasing wages. So that capital is exported to parts of the global south. It's used to, do things what we would ordinarily call foreign direct investment, but which basically means, monopolies often setting up branches or outsourcing production or, generally undertaking various different forms of investment, which actually extract over the long run capital from the global south, because you're building a factory, you're underpaying workers, you're producing profit that is reshored to the global north. And it's that process again which underpins this distinction, in the same way that I talked about how the financialization of the household is underpinned by imperialism at the level of the global economy. When you think about businesses, the profits that are distributed in stock markets come from hyper exploitation in the global south. So as well as the big bubble in finance and real estate that supported the boom that took place in the period between kind of 2000 and 2007, a big factor underlying the growth in wealth that is in the stock markets, the growth of market capitalization of market capitalization to GDP ratio in lots of different countries across the global north, is the fact that these profits are being extracted from the global south. And it underpins this kind of new international division of labor, where you can have headquarters of many firms located in, London, New York. So things like accounting, operations, marketing, advertising, finance, these professions are all concentrated in countries like the US and the UK. So it looks like those countries aren't producing anything anymore, and they're just doing all this kind of top level professional stuff. But actually it's that the production is just taking place elsewhere, because we've got this kind of massive division of labor at the level of the international economy. So yeah, I think, the difference, probably there's many differences between the kind of post-Keynesian approach to financialization, which is interesting, but isn't the same as the Marxist approach. I think the main one is that, again, the Marxist approach always comes down to a holistic perspective on capitalist social relations as a whole. So it's not just saying, oh, look, there's more, big banks doing more stuff. It's actually saying, right, so how have capitalist social relations changed as a result of the greater share of financial profits in total profits? And also, how did a shift in social relations actually help to underpin that transition as well? So yeah, I don't really see, again, those things as separate. I see them as kind of mutually reinforcing.
And I think we got another really big question on the state, which we're going to come back to in a bit. But I wanted to ask first, because you could have also pursued an academic career and could have just written your PhD and then, I don't know, have a lecture on this. But you decided to write a more popular book. This is so accessible. And I think this is also the strength of the book. And we don't have that in like the German discourse. This is why we wanted to translate it. So why did you choose to write that book and not just pursue your academic career and then, just, I don't know, something's happening in political life, but I don't care, a kind of attitude? But what made you write the book?
That's an interesting question. It was partly my partner who very much encouraged me, who is also very involved in a lot of the political stuff that was going on over the last 5 years. I actually said, I think it was in 2017, I'm going to do a PhD. And he was like, why would you do that? Like, by the time you finish, the political moment will be gone and there won't be anything left for you to do. Basically, you should write a book. And I was obviously like, had all these things about like, oh, well, why would I write a book? I'm not like enough of an expert to write a book. Like, I don't have a PhD. How can I write a book? But he and many other people encouraged me to do that. And I think I'm really glad I did because, you know, I think like the work that basically my book is built on the work of other people, right? It's not like I have gone in, collected data and undertaken a completely original analysis and like put that into work that can then be used by other people. I've drawn on the research that's been done in academia and translated that into a popular register. And I kind of realized that is actually where my strength as an author lies. Like, I probably could do a PhD if I wanted to and try and go down that route of kind of creating original research. I mean, it would be very, very difficult, especially at the moment, because academics are facing huge pressures in terms of, well, in the jobs market, because academic work has become much more precarious and there just aren't enough jobs to go around. And also just in terms of the pressures that they're under to kind of demonstrate impact and all those sorts of things that are specific to the UK. So, I mean, a lot of my academic friends are actually finding this particular moment very, very difficult. But also I think that, like, you know, I can sit in this quite unique position of working with academics. And I do work with a lot of academics in a lot of different universities, but actually having my focus not as academia and not as, you know, the kind of informed people who are kind of doing all the research in these areas, is actually towards the public. And yeah, I think it's interesting because academics used to do a lot more of that. Like, people who wrote deep theoretical texts would also write popular texts. Marx did it. He wrote the Communist Manifesto, right? But I think it's become much more specialized now. So you're an academic, you focus very much on research, and if you can, you do some teaching as well. Whereas, you know, if you're a journalist, you report on what the academics are saying and don't really try and conceptualize it in a new way. So I thought there was a bit of a space there to just like take some of these ideas and actually convey them to the people who are most likely to be affected by them.
Yeah, and I think you did. Like, I would, I don't know, I would give it to people that I usually, I don't know, wouldn't like learn or, I don't know, usually read economic news. But I think you can give it to people and people understand much more of what is happening and how we got there. So I think this is something that was really needed at the time, as you said. Not that this is something completely new, but that this is so condensed and accessible, and I don't know, just in a way that you can give it to people and you feel like, wow, this is really Aufklärung in a good sense. Like, this is actually making people smarter about life. So back to this, back to the topic and back to this really complicated question, but did you employ like Marxist state theory, or what is the role of the state in all of this? Because you've mentioned Thatcher and Reagan, and obviously governments play a role in manufacturing that kind of consent, but also, what role does the state play in all of this?
Yeah, it's a good question. And to be honest, it's underdeveloped in Stolen. I'm taking it forward much more in this book, which draws a lot on, you know, the work of people like Palantzas, Ralph Miliband, Bob Jessup, when thinking about the state. But yeah, it's less of a presence in Stolen. I think there's a lot of reasons for that. Partly it's because of the way that my research has been focused. So the book actually came out of some research that I did whilst working at a think tank. And, you know, when you're working at a think tank, it's very focused on policy. You write the policy, you lobby the government, and you just assume that that policy will be implemented. It's a very naive view of state power, but that was kind of where the research was coming from. And also it was the political context. So, you know, basically I didn't think that I was writing the book to influence the government or the state. I was really writing it both to kind of create a swell of public support for these ideas that would hopefully influence the Labour Party to change its manifesto, and then this idea that that Corbyn's Labour as a kind of movement party with a big more accountability between the leadership and the base than the average Labour administration would then be under pressure to actually follow through on some of these things and try and implement them, even in the context of what would undoubtedly be a massive backlash from the civil service, from capital, from whatever. And in that sense, it was relatively successful because there was a shift, I think, in Labour's policy platform between 2017 and 2019 towards there being a much greater focus on the finance sector, really thinking about some of these issues in much more depth. Partly, I don't think that it wasn't always or even predominantly my specific proposals that ended up going in there, but I think like my work helped to create a climate in which a lot more people were focusing on finance and financialization and their work. So people like Matt Lawrence, who wrote the proposal about inclusive ownership funds, Laurie McFarlane and Christine Berry did this great report looking at creating kind of a system of public retail banks, which was really, really good. So yeah, that was kind of what I was looking towards. And as a result, there was less of a kind of critical approach to state power. In the book I'm currently writing, I don't want to say, it's not that I'm more cynical about the capacity to use the state to affect transformation, because I said that in the last book. I'm like, look, it doesn't matter how many good policies you have. If you don't have a movement that's willing to push for them and fight for them, then that nothing's going to happen. But it's certainly more kind of overtly and critically theorized in this book. So yeah, the next book I'm writing about basically looks at capitalist planning. So it looks at basically how, the idea of kind of free market capitalism is a misnomer because a substantial amount of the decisions about the production, allocation, and distribution of resources are undertaken by a set of powerful interests that kind of make those decisions themselves as part of their plans for whatever it is they're planning for, generally to kind of maximize their profits and promote their interests, rather than being a kind of automatic response to price signals or to, democratic pressure, which is what's theorized in a lot of the kind of neoclassical economics and political liberal tradition. And part of that is looking at the nature of the capitalist state, the power that is exercised within the state by various different groups, including, groups that represent class interests, seeing the state as a kind of a site of struggle between different class interests and groups within those classes. And yeah, kind of looking at the roles played by particular sections of capital in helping to articulate the interests of the capitalist class as a whole, and then push through that in the state. And actually, in that sense, the finance sector is very important for a lot of different reasons, but partly because, as a sector that doesn't have internally this like big division between labor and capital, because basically, the finance sector doesn't produce stuff itself. It, speculates over and redistributes surplus value that's produced elsewhere. There is less of this divide between labor and capital within the sector, which kind of makes it more able to perhaps say the quiet part out loud, where other firms might not be able to do so because they face much more of a backlash. And the lobbying of the finance sector has been really, really important in a lot of different policy changes that have happened over the last several decades. So yeah, and the answer to that question is no, it wasn't theorized well enough in the last book for some reasons, some of which were good, some of which weren't, but more of that work is now being done. Again, partly because I think in the wake of the Corbyn project, the left has much less of an excuse in the UK to be naive about state power. Because obviously, a big part of why Corbynism failed was that it came up against big constraints from within the British state.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we have to talk about the political context in a bit, but I want to show the book again because people are coming in new, and obviously you want to see the book because you come in here for that, and you can just order it. We have the link in the description sector at Brumer Verlag. It's like 400 pages. It's a lot. It's actually much more thicker in German than it is in English, obviously. But so you have a lot to read, and it costs 18 euro, and we just send it to you. You don't have to pay extra. So just order it. And I think you hinted it in the book at some point, someone asked, what is your opinion on modern monetary theory? Because more specifically, do you think it was invented to avoid redistribution of wealth? Or could you see any usage of it? Does it conflict with what you're thinking, like, completely?
I think the best description I've heard about MMT is that what is novel about it isn't important, and what is important about it isn't novel. So there are some elements of the whole theory that are really important, like sectoral balances, for example, which basically looks at how, how the balances of different sectors of the economy, so households, the state, businesses, etc., are linked to one another, which comes down to this, theory that basically when the government reduces its spending, it has to be made up for by higher spending in other sections of the economy if output isn't to fall. And often that involves replacing public debt, which is cheap and, obviously more fairly distributed, with private debt, which is much more expensive and unevenly distributed, often with, working class people paying much higher interest rates than wealthier people. I think that's really good. It's also kind of modern monetary theory is also linked with questions about like sectoral balances, balances between different states at the level of the global economy. Kind of looking at current account surpluses and deficits, how they're linked to financial account surpluses and deficits, and the way in which that kind of potentially reinforces what Marxists might call dependency, relationships of dependency in the international economy and kind of imperialism, although they wouldn't put it in those terms. And obviously, there is the critical point that a state that is in control of its own monetary policy and is a kind of relatively powerful state within the global economy does have the capacity to create money out of nothing and use that in whatever way it wants to. So that there isn't this hard constraint on the government's capacity to borrow. Instead, the constraint on both borrowing as in issuing bonds and borrowing as in and creating new money is inflation. So if you borrow ad infinitum, there's this inflationary pressure that potentially creates all sorts of instability, all the way running up all the way to kind of hyperinflation. And it's the same with creating money, showing that point has been really, really important, because there is this idea, like in the work of kind of Reinhardt and Rogoff, saying if you go above 90% of GDP, government debt to GDP, then everything's going to fall apart. When obviously that isn't the case. You have to look at this when it comes to, so you have to look at these questions in the context of other economic indicators, obviously inflation being one of them, and we're living in a very, very low inflation environment in many parts of the global north. So that's important. The other thing as well is looking at the role of banks in the economy. So the fact that most money creation is undertaken by banks in the form of loans, and that is, an unequal and unfair and undemocratic way of kind of allocating these powers of seigniorage, of profiting from money creation. The things that are problematic about it are the political implications. So often a kind of crude version of MMT is, you can print as much money as you want and there's no constraints on resources. Of course there are. There may not be constraints on money, but there are constraints on resources. So if you create too much money and that isn't used in an efficient way to, extend the amount of resources or to make the resources that you have be used more efficiently, then you're going to come up against problems. The other thing is that, again, a crude expression of MMT would be to say states can print as much money as they want to get out of crises. That isn't, of course, true of states in the global south, of states whose monetary policy is constrained, like those in the Eurozone. And it risks creating this narrative that, things like debt renegotiation at the level of the global economy aren't necessary because kind of, government debt like isn't a real thing, which is of course not true. So yeah, I think, as I said, what's novel about it isn't important, and what's important isn't novel. And I think often, the demand for ideas like MMT and why it's become so popular is based on the fact that people want to be able to kind of build a more progressive economy through like quick fix solutions that don't require struggle. And this is again like the GameStop thing, right? Like, oh, we can't use our power as workers to struggle against bosses, so we're just going to participate in the system and like screw it up that way. But it doesn't work. Like, you need to have a class analysis. Capitalism is not going to change without conflict. The only times that we've seen really substantial changes in the nature of capitalism has been through conflict, generally conflict between labor and capital, between workers and bosses. And yeah, if without that, we're not going to see improvements. I think obviously, as we move into an age where that labor capital divide has changed so much, there are other forms of struggle and other dichotomies that the left can draw on to build a wider coalition. So, renters versus owners, debtors and creditors, all these are linked into that labor capital relation in a way that can be useful. But without conflict, basically, we aren't going to see any change. And people kind of don't really like that because it seems, nobody likes conflict. Everyone wants to believe that if we can all just get along, we can make the world work better. But of course, that fails to address the fact that some people aren't interested in making the world better because they're benefiting from how it is now.
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking if any left government in the UK, in Germany, in the US, I mean, we're going to talk about the realistic or the kind of realism that we have to face now. But like, could a left government just use it, like for investments, for example? I mean, that's the argument, right? You could just use it for investments and then deploy some of the insights that MMT gives. But as you say, I think without the class struggle and still like powerful workers, I don't think how you can actually force that through, because not any government can just use it as a tool. Like, this is not a technical question, or not only.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely not only a technical question. I think what's interesting now is that if you were to have, and this is why I think the struggle over the state is going to step up a lot in the years to come. Because the state is going to be, and I talk about why this is in my next book, but is increasingly important in supporting capital accumulation as a whole, both because, it's needed for constant bailouts to like support capital during moments of crisis, but also because, we live in such a complex economy that things like regulation and taxation and all these different sorts of things are very, very important for determining like what's produced and who gets what. So the state is an increasingly important site of struggle. And when it comes to this question of QE, I mean, what banks have been doing already in terms of asset purchases has been unbelievably huge, like massive interventions, particularly over the course of the pandemic. And central banks already have a lot of assets on their balance sheets. So like in the UK, for example, a big chunk of outstanding government debt is already owned by the Bank of England. And the Bank of England has already started actively buying, well, basically it's given the government an overdraft. So it's basically already done a version of this kind of investment through money creation. Obviously, that hasn't changed anything because, we still have a conservative government. And even though that conservative government knows that there isn't this constraint on spending, that government needs there to be a constraint on spending so that it can carry on basically maintaining the power relations that benefit it. So, it wants to say we can't spend more money through fiscal policy, but we can do QE because they're different things and no one understands this one. And what's that going to mean? Oh, it means investment falls, wages fall for like most people. And yet we can protect our coalition, the people who are disproportionately likely to vote for us, which is older homeowners, by pushing up asset prices across the board through this program of quantitative easing. So yeah, like it doesn't change the political scenario because like it's already happening. The interesting thing is that because this has already happened and because central banks have all these assets on their balance sheets, I've seen a lot of ideas being thrown around as to what a left government could do with those assets when in power if it wanted to touch if change the mandate of the central bank or touch central bank independence, you could have something like a new national investment bank that was capitalized using the assets that have already been bought through quantitative easing. It could, have those assets as its capital base and then go out and borrow on international markets or wherever. And like that is something that you could already do. But the thing is, because that is something that you can already do, because the potential for that is so obvious once we've had this long period of quantitative easing, the struggle over the state is going to be so much more important. The barriers to getting for working people to get that power are going to be so much more significant. So the tools are there. That isn't the question. The question is where the power is. And that is obviously why, the focus should always be on building up a movement rather than, saying, oh, why on earth isn't the government doing this clever thing that's going to fix all these problems?
Mm-hmm. And I mean, you've hinted at the context of the book that you wanted to give proposals to a government that never actually then came, but still, I think it's worthwhile to talk about the proposals. And I still think, even though we say without the struggle, without the movement, it doesn't mean a lot. I think it gives you an idea of what could happen now, what you could do still. So maybe you can elaborate a little bit on what does Finance for People say? How do you have, you have a socialist standpoint, and this is not the usual way of thinking about finance, I guess. So yeah, what are the proposals? What could you actually do to have some kind of power shift? Because you say you cannot go back to just before 2008. You cannot just have an economy that is completely different and kind of before the crash or something. So what do you do? How do you reform then the institutions, or how do you build new institutions, as you just said?
Yeah, so there is this question, and it's quite big in progressive policy circles, and also, kind of in left movements more generally, about democratizing finance. Actually, Michael McCarthy has written a really good review of all the proposals that have been made as part of this idea that we can democratize finance. And I wrote some of them in the book. I put some of them together in the book. And basically, they center on, there's lots of different ways of doing this. Firstly, there's some changes that need to be made to the banking system. So, the fact that these banks are basically given the power to create money by the state, and yet they aren't generally held particularly accountable for where that money goes, is a real problem. So things like, from things like nationalization to various forms of what's called macroprudential policy, directing where lending goes, basically, are being put forward. And I put forward some answers to that question in the book to basically try and influence where lending and investment goes. So to kind of use this power of planning that the capitalist state and financial sector already has, but to do it in a democratic and transparent way. Then there's this question of investment. So lending is on the one side, which is done by banks. There's also the question of investment, which is, to do with where savings end up going in the economy. It mediates ownership, which is important. So obviously, lending by a bank to a company is different than shareholdings in a bank. This is a form of ownership. So yeah, that's also really, really important. And again, because if done in a coordinated way, you can potentially change patterns of ownership in the economy, but it does require coordinated action, and generally coordinated action by a public entity. So I propose for the creation of what's called a people's asset manager in my book, the idea of which is basically that we have this huge pot of pension savings of various different forms of investment that could be used to influence the decisions that are made by corporations, but which isn't, obviously, and which won't be unless it's kind of coordinated in some way. So having a people's asset manager that it has a democratically elected board that says, right, where are people's pensions going to be invested? Where is, potentially the funds in a sovereign wealth fund going to be invested? Shall we invest in, green energy, or invest in this company and try and influence to do this, or try and, get people to pay their workers more or whatever? That was another idea in the book. There's also this question about retail banking and of how we deal with the debt crisis that is inevitably going to come out of this pandemic as well. What we're going to see, actually, and what we're already seeing during the pandemic, is a big increase in inequality between people who have wealth and people who have more debt than wealth. And the wealthy have often been able to accrue big savings because they've been spending less, and a lot of that is going into financial markets, whereas some people have seen their incomes fall and their outgoings remain the same. So that's created a big divide there. So we need to be thinking about making debt more sustainable for low-income families. That might mean a debt write-off. It might mean restructuring that debt. But what we do need is a kind of system of public retail banking through which that could be affected, and which would kind of ensure that everyone had access to the banking system and had that in a fair way as well. So yeah, I haven't gone into all of them by any means there, but there's a lot of proposals about how to kind of democratize and socialize the finance sector. And yeah, in the hands of a movement that could be really, really powerful. It is just a question of how we get from here to there, I suppose.
Yeah. And I guess, I mean, you said it that at the moment in time when you wrote it, you thought this could actually be like real at some point, or it could be useful for a movement. But now, like, how do you look at the state of the left now? Not just in the UK, but I mean, also, I guess, in Europe in general, or I mean, if you want to be that broad, even I don't know, the US, something like you need a strong left movement, a socialist movement to change the finance sector as it is right now, obviously. Yeah, what is your understanding of this? Where are we now? I mean, far away from it than 2 years ago, I guess. Also, in light of the pandemic and rising inequality, I guess it's a paradox situation, because it's more necessary than ever to change it, but it seems more unreal or more unrealistic. And yeah, I mean, this also hints to my last question, like, why should people read Stolen and to get an understanding of why you need a socialist movement to change it? What kind of forces do we need to make the changes that are necessary?
Yeah. So, I mean, obviously, on the surface, things don't look that great for the left. We've had the defeat of Corbynism in the UK, the Sanders movement in the US. You've got, pretty horrific, like semi-authoritarian regimes in places like Brazil. There's obviously been a relapse a kind of move back, or the potential that could be reversed over the next week or so in Ecuador. Obviously that a similar sort of danger happened in Bolivia, but that was again pushed back on. Lots of the kind of like socialist or socialist leaning parties that emerged in Southern Europe after the financial crisis ended up being defanged, and there aren't that many beacons of hope around the world other than around Europe. Portugal obviously has a vaguely good government, and Spain's been going in an okay direction, but there's nothing like the kind of energy behind what we saw with, the origins of Syriza and Podemos and the Sanders movement and the Corbyn movement. But that is inevitable. We had a big crisis. People suddenly saw the nature of capitalism exposed, right in front of them. And then their living standards continued to decline as the banks got these bailouts. There was inevitably going to be this populist backlash. And the issue is now, of course, that as those movements have failed, people might start to think, well, socialism isn't possible. So if we want real substantial change, we're going to have to vote for a reactionary far-right group. And that's obviously been the really big trend over the last couple of years, is that as the energy for transforming capitalism has sapped, the discontent that people feel with the status quo has been channeled into the far right. And even though, Trump was defeated, that could easily have gone the other way because of a lot of, again, relatively poor working class voters still voting for Trump because of this idea that, the elite establishment is coordinated against them. And it is not far from the truth. The trust in democracy all over the world is falling. Young people are the most likely to say that they don't think democracy is a good way of organizing our political system, basically because it's been captured by people at the very top. And it's very obvious that the state is basically used by big business. And that's only a slight exaggeration to promote its own interests. So yeah, I mean, the left is suffering as a result of that shift in how people's discontent with the status quo is being expressed. But that discontent isn't going away. And as long as that discontent isn't going away. And I think if the left was able to organize itself better, there is no reason why it couldn't be channeled back into the support for socialism. I mean, the real question here is the approach that center-left political parties take, and that socialist movements within and outside those parties take with respect to them as well. There's a danger that, in the UK, we can see people like Starmer basically refusing to adopt this kind of left populist approach and instead saying it's all about competence. We're just going to agree with the government all the time and say we'll do it slightly better. That is not going to encourage people who have left Labour to come back to Labour generally. It's certainly not going to encourage the number of people that are required to come back to the Labour Party, to come back to the Labour Party. A big problem all across the rich world is that working class people are just dropping out of the electorate and just saying they're all the same. What's the point in voting? And that creates difficulties for left parties who rely on those votes of working class people to get over the line. Yeah, I mean, it's about the strategies that are taken by parties. It's also about the strategies taken by the left. So, if we want to change the way that political parties are behaving, we need to build up movements outside of those parties and within those parties. It means focusing on the labor movement, the environmental movement, having really kind of coherent and, important direct actions that cut through, that highlights particular antagonisms and that disrupt capital accumulation. All these questions of left strategy are really, really important. They haven't gone away. It's just, we had this big swell that was inevitable after the last crisis that eventually dissipated. As this crisis continues and as we see the results, I'm sure that there will be, the opportunity and a moment for the left to actually, channel that discontent and take it back from the far right. I do think that potential is still there. It's just a question of strategy and how we capture this moment.
Yeah, and I mean, you said it yourself that the left doesn't only need a strategy, but also like a coherent form of expressing it. And I think the GameStop saga, just to come back to it, for the last time tonight, is showing that, because I felt like there's such a lack of understanding of what it means to be just part of the market in having assets and buying them, or having real power over actual companies or like actual bosses, or I can see that there are some people feeling a kind of sense of community, but I guess or I really believe that your book helps in telling people, teaching people on how to think about this in structural reforms, and also in understanding that actually building power is the only thing that we can do to have these structural reforms. Otherwise, we're just really playing the same game, but we're always going to lose. And I'm really thankful that you tell us a little bit about how to win and give that kind of horizon or that idea of how to do that. So yeah, thank you again for writing it and for taking your time tonight to talk about it.
No, thank you guys so much for all the help with the translation, for people who did the translation, for Jacobin, for writing about it, for doing the interview, for hosting this event, for everything that you guys have done. And I can't wait until I can come back to Germany and do something in person.
Yeah, we have to do so many events, because I mean, last time you were in Berlin, it was full, it was packed. We were 300 people here in Kreuzberg, and it was
I was not there for long enough. I could have done so many more events, but it was such a rushed tour. I was going from, I think that week I'd been in Ireland, Belgium, the Netherlands, and then Germany, and then I was going back to the UK. So it was just a bit,
it was intense.
But next time I will have much longer in Germany.
Yeah, and I hope that the copy will reach you, because it's really so beautiful. And you
Brexit
said it already. I mean, I'm going to do this in German, so don't feel left out. But I have to thank the people who worked on this right now, because am Ende einer solchen Veranstaltung ist es immer wichtig, denen zu danken, die daran mitgearbeitet haben, dass so ein Buch zustande kommt. Und zuallererst natürlich an Thomas Zimmermann, der das Buch übersetzt hat. Thomas, he translated all your texts, actually.
So much.
All the articles.
Appreciation for Thomas Zimmermann. Thank you so much.
He lives in your brain now. He already, he expects, I think Grace is going to write something about this at some point. So, danke an dich, Thomas, und an Astrid Zimmermann für das Lektorat, and there's always someone who has to proofread everything, so all the 400 pages. So thank you, Astrid.
No, thank
and
you.
then also Andreas Faust, danke natürlich auch dir für das Cover-Design. Ich kann es nochmal von innen zeigen. Es hat diesen wunderschönen Umschlag mit diesem Bild und ich weiß, wer Bücher liebt, das ist wirklich ein sehr besonderes Buch und wie gesagt, wir freuen uns, dass es die Erstausgabe auf Deutsch ist. Es hat 400 Seiten und wir danken allen, die daran mitgearbeitet haben, auch Rory Witt, der den Satzspiegel gemacht hat. Also sehr viel Arbeit ist darin reingeflossen, die man ihm hoffentlich auch ansieht und ich hoffe, ihr habt eure Freude damit. Die Farbe war so besonders und wir drucken auf ökologischem Papier, was es natürlich besonders nachhaltig und toll macht, was aber dazu geführt hat, dass dieses Ökopapier diese unfassbare Farbe besonders aufgesaugt hat und das Ganze verwischt hat. Also das Cover ist so gut, dass es mit normalem Ökopapier nicht zu machen ist. Deswegen mussten wir es jetzt nochmal drucken. Und alle, die es schon bestellt haben, ihr braucht keine Angst zu haben, wir drucken es einfach noch einmal und es kommt auf jeden Fall nächste Woche Montag bei euch an. Aber ich sollte das sagen, dass das Coverdesign so besonders ist, dass es tatsächlich ein paar Tage länger dauert. Insofern tut es uns leid, aber es ist auch unser erstes Buch und das war nicht abzusehen, dass dieses Cover so viel mehr Arbeit machen würde. Aber ich glaube, es hat sich gelohnt und ihr könnt euch auf jeden Fall freuen, es zu bestellen, denn es sieht wirklich sehr, sehr gut aus im Bücherregal und es wird, wie ich schon sagte, wir haben darüber gerade eine Stunde geredet, ihr werdet es nicht missen oder werdet es auf jeden Fall brauchen bei allen möglichen Diskussionen über politische Ökonomie. Wir verschicken es am Montag, ihr könnt es bestellen. Unten in den Descriptions sind die ganzen Links auch nochmal zu finden, entweder direkt beim Primärverlag bei uns. Das ist natürlich viel besser, als es bei Amazon zu bestellen oder sonst wo. Am besten direkt in unserem Shop. Das ist die beste Variante. Dann senden wir es versandkostenfrei zu an euch ab nächsten Montag. Und ansonsten besucht gern die Jacobin-Seite und lest uns. Wir stellen Graces Artikel immer wieder, wir übersetzen immer wieder gern von ihr. Sie schreibt ja auch für Jacobin und für Tribune. Und verfolgt, was wir machen. Und thank you, Grace, for tonight.
Thank you
and
so much.
See you soon again. And also good luck with your new book.
Thank you.
Sounds interesting, sounds exciting.
Yeah, no, thank you to you guys again, and also to all my the people who've been following my work in Germany. I apologize for my appalling lack of language skills, but thankfully most of you are clearly highly fluent in English. So I'm very, very happy about that. The next several books I hope will be translated into German as well, so they can be consumed by as wide an audience as possible.
Yeah. Thank you and
good night.
Good night.
Thank you.